Is your startup growing too slow? Maybe blitzscaling can help. Today we'll talk about this with Chris. Chris, hi.
Delighted to be here.
Who are you and what do you do?
So I'm Chris Yeh, and I do a whole variety of things. But for today, the most important thing is I write books. So I previously co-authored a book called The Alliance with my friends Reid Hoffman and Ben Kasnoka, and that came out last year, 2014. And we are currently working on our next book, which is going to be focused on the concept of blitzscaling, which is growing startups extremely rapidly to an extremely large size.
Besides being an author, what did you do before?
So I have a classic sort of Silicon Valley background. I studied engineering, but also creative writing when I was an undergraduate at Stanford. Worked in the high-tech industry since 1995 in various startups. I actually was in Boston for a while working for D.E. Shaw and Company, which is the company Jeff Bezos worked for before he started Amazon. Sadly, he had left before I arrived, so I never got a chance to really work with him. But then I've been out here in Silicon Valley since 2000, so doing a variety of things, starting companies, investing, advising, mentoring young entrepreneurs and the like.
Cool stuff. Let's talk about blitzscaling. Can you please elaborate on the concept of blitzscaling?
Sure. So the concept of blitzscaling really comes from the notion of there is something special about the kind of speed with which you can grow startups, especially here in Silicon Valley and in certain other parts of the world like China. Everyone knows that companies want to grow, right? Every company believes in growth. But for most companies, that kind of growth is, hey, can we grow 10% a year? Can we grow 15% a year? Can we steadily climb? And this is a classic way that a lot of companies have been successful in the past. But we increasingly see companies just grow to an enormous scale incredibly quickly. So Facebook, for example, gets started less than a decade later. It's the biggest website in the world. Google gets started as a little obscure graduate student project, and within 10 years, it's the world's biggest media company. So we looked at this and said, well, what is going on here? What has changed to allow companies to grow so big, so quickly? And what are the characteristics that make it happen more often in Silicon Valley and in China than in any other place?
Cool. For what type of companies does blitzscaling apply?
So blitzscaling is applying to an increasingly large number of companies. As you know, a number of years ago, Marc Andreessen came up with this thesis that software is eating the world. And increasingly, technology is becoming embedded in pretty much every industry. And while the book is going to focus primarily on the high-tech industry, there are other industries that have gone through enormous changes in a very rapid way that have nothing to do with technology. So for example, in the oil and gas or energy industry, the shale oil boom over the past decade has just completely transformed the energy landscape of the United States. And that all took place because of a number of small startups that very quickly became enormous. So I think it applies broadly and will apply to more and more industries as software continues to eat the world.
Can you simplify it that the blitzscaling mainly applies to companies who can benefit from economies of scale, or is there anything else involved in there?
So what I would say is blitzscaling primarily focuses on companies where there are network effects. And network effects mean that as you grow the number of nodes in the network, the value of the entire network grows far greater than the linear growth in the number of nodes. And one of the fundamental theses we have about blitzscaling is the reason why it has worked so well in Silicon Valley is because of the incredible strength of the network here. There are only 7 million people in the Metro Bay Area, which is a tiny fraction of the world. There's 7 million people here. There's 7 billion in the world as a whole. But half of the world's most valuable startup companies are here in Silicon Valley, and then half are in that other 7 billion people. So what's going on here? And it really is because there's this dense network of connections between investors, entrepreneurs, people who are employers, employees, professional service firms. All these people are able to come together very quickly in a way that you can't in many other environments.
And from my perception is what has changed over the last 20 years or so is the world has become more connected.
Yes.
Because due to the fact that we have an internet right now.
Correct.
And the second thing is here in the valley you have so much capital poured in so that you can fund the rocket ship, so to speak. And if you then change the mindset of the people, then you have the 3 ingredients for making scaling companies faster.
That's right. And the capital is obviously, the 2 most important things are the capital and the talent. And this is where Silicon Valley has long held an advantage. But if you look at what's happening over in China, for example, with the kind of financing that's going into Didi Kuai and other sorts of companies that are there, that capital is now becoming more available globally than ever before. And I know that in Europe, there's a lot more capital available than was available in the past. And so in many ways, what we see happening is blitzscaling becoming more and more common in places outside of Silicon Valley because of that very effect that you mentioned, because the world is far more connected than it was before.
Imagine I'm a startup or CEO of a startup outside of the Bay Area. And I read about your book and said, hey, I should blitzscale.
Yeah.
How do I do that?
So what you're going to focus on in terms of blitzscaling is picking the right moment to do so. So the term blitzscaling comes from the term blitzkrieg, and of course there's a bad history around that word and the folks who originally, the leadership that originally promoted it. But it is actually something very different than the traditional means of war. Right? Blitzkrieg meant cutting loose from your supply lines and attacking far more quickly than anyone ever thought possible. And in fact, during the Battle of France, many people will say, well, the French actually had better tanks than the Wehrmacht did, but the Wehrmacht's tactics and strategy overwhelmed them. And so for us, blitzscaling is all about knowing that when you have the right moment, when you are in the situation where all of a sudden you need to grow quickly, you have the opportunity to grow quickly, the capital is available, the talent is available, being willing to make that decision. So here's a great example. I was just reading about Google the other day. It's a fascinating story. So Google is, enormously successful today. Once upon a time was a little tiny startup. And one of the things that Google did in its infancy was that it reached a deal with America Online to monetize America Online's search and advertising and page views and the like. And at the time, Google was a relatively small company. They'd only ever raised $25 million, basically one round of funding, and they had only $10 million left in the bank. And they signed a deal with America Online where they said, AOL, we're going to take over ad sales. We're going to take 15% as our cut. You take 85%, and we're going to guarantee you $150 million a year in minimum revenues. So a company with $10 million in the bank struck a deal with what was then sort of the giant in the field, and guaranteed them $150 million a year. Now that's the kind of aggressiveness that's required in order to blitzscale. It's taking a risk. It's doing things that feel uncomfortable, that don't necessarily have a 100% chance of succeeding, but which are necessary in order to achieve the kind of scale that you need. Because once Google had that deal with AOL, once they had that vast volume of additional traffic, of course they were able to learn much more quickly, develop their monetization, and ultimately, in the end, they never had any problems making those minimums.
Okay, cool. And is there some kind of checkbox or checklist or so where I can say, okay, if this and this conditions are fulfilled, then I should blitzscale?
Yes. So there are a couple of things. The first, of course, I think you referenced it, is the accessibility of capital. Right? Capital is kind of the lifeblood of blitzscaling. If you were able to scale up at this incredible rate and profits were just gushing in, well, that's relatively easy to do. In the case of Google, they were profitable, but they took on a gigantic commitment that was far bigger than anything they had in the past. But in many cases, it's based on saying, well, we're going to grow faster than, strictly speaking, efficiency would call for, but it's because we believe that this is a decisive point in time in the history of this industry, and we have a chance to grow to a scale where we will eventually be one of the winner-take-all winners. I think the other part of it, besides the capital being available, is looking at the overall situation around you. We are teaching a class on blitzscaling at Stanford right now, and we had a guest on, Mariam Nafisi, who runs a company right now called Minted. And what was interesting is she chose not to scale the company very, very rapidly at the outset. So many years the company was relatively small. She only raised several, single-digit millions. And only in the past couple of years has she raised another $90 million to scale the company up. And it's grown now. It's over 500 employees and growing extremely rapidly. But one of the reasons she did that is as the company began to grow out of its original niche, it began to encounter other competitors. And because there was now competition, one of the things she said was, now I need to be more aggressive about growth. If I'm being ignored, I might be willing to grow a little more quietly. And in her case, she deliberately did that because it felt more comfortable. But then when the competition was there, she said, well, I'm willing to feel uncomfortable in order to win. And that's where the blitzscaling came in.
And what type of pain points are you feeling when you're doing blitzscaling? I mean, especially in terms of organization, if you are growing from like 10 to 100 people in 6 months, or from 100 to 1,000 in a year, there are some organizational challenges, etc.
Absolutely. So one of the fundamental frameworks of blitzscaling is that the organization changes radically at each stage. And so we divide it up into 5 different stages. We have a metaphor for this. So the first stage is what we call the family. And this is what we call when you have ones of employees, like 1 to 10 or so. And the whole thing about a family is everyone knows each other, they're all under one roof, it tends to be informal, there's not a very set org structure. And that's fine when you're starting out. And in fact, it can be very efficient if you have a group of people who are used to working with each other. But as it grows, it eventually goes from a family to a tribe. And now you may not have everyone under the same roof, everyone's not seeing each other every single day, although everyone still knows each other. And now you're starting to see some elements of organization. You may have some more specialization than before. Hey, I'm going to focus on engineering, I'm going to focus on operations, etc. And that will take you from 10 to 100 employees or 10 to 50 employees or something along those lines. The next level up is what we call the village. Once you get to the village stage, you may not instantly be able to recognize everyone when you see them. You know, you've been in a company before with like 100, 150 people. You're starting to approach Dunbar's number. And it's difficult to have that same kind of relationship that you had when you were a tribe or even a family. And so the notion is now all of a sudden the organization begins to take on more of the characteristics that we think of a company. There are going to be functional areas, there are going to be senior managers, there's going to be additional managers that are hired in to help coordinate everything. And that becomes more pronounced as it continues to grow and scale. The next scale up, after you get past the village stage, is what we call the city phase. So if you think about a village, everyone might they see another village resident, they're like, okay, yeah, I kind of know that guy, I've seen him before. You get to the city phase, which is to say thousands of employees, and there are employees who will never meet. Now all of a sudden, you're dealing with something that's less a unitary body where you can just have a single all hands and the CEO can shake hands with everyone. And now you're dealing with a set of constituencies. You need to now govern it. And the governance becomes increasingly important. And that continues to the next level up, which is tens of thousands of employees, which is a nation. Right? A nation, all of a sudden, a city often just sort of looks to govern itself and looks to its immediate surrounding. A nation now has to be aware of geopolitics, has to be aware of adjacent nations, of other players in the game of great powers. When a company has reached that stage, all of a sudden, now you're Google and you're like, well, we had been cooperating with Apple, but now we're competing with Apple on Android. We're competing with Microsoft on search, but we're also competing with them because we have Google Docs and they have Microsoft Office. And all of a sudden, the notion of how these great nations interact with each other becomes a critical part of what you do as you're blitzscaling.
I totally agree. I think for every company, no matter how fast it grows, if it gets really, really big, it will follow those 5 phases.
Right.
The issue from my point of view for blitzscaling is only that you are not doing this like maybe in 10, 20 years,
right,
but maybe in 1 or 2 years.
Correct. And the reason why that's so important is when a company grows to that scale, let's say over a couple of decades, it's never easy, but it's easier because what happens is people have the chance to scale and grow along with the company, and there's natural attrition, you bring in new people. Right? When a company is scaling at this incredible rate, from a couple of founders to thousands of employees in less than a presidential administration or 4 years, the human beings simply can't scale that quickly, and most human beings can't. And so now you are trying to figure out, how can I bring in new leaders and new managers and executives who have the experience to work at these higher levels of scale while still respecting the contributions of those who've come before, figuring out how to make sure people continue to have roles, or if they no longer have roles, figuring out what the right transition and the right way to treat each other is. So that's what makes that growth so challenging, because you are scaling at a rate that is faster than a human being can actually scale.
So does this mean that you should look for managers or employees in general that could potentially work in each and every of those 4 or 5 phases?
So that's the interesting thing. A lot of people think, well, let's get somebody who has been able to do it all. And that's great. So if you can go out and hire Eric Schmidt or Larry Page into your company to work for you, you should do that. Yeah. But it's very difficult to find that. In fact, what you instead get is there are people who will tend to specialize in bigger companies and people who tend to specialize in smaller companies. It's very rare that somebody's going to have experience at all levels. Yeah. And even if they do have experience at all levels, they're going to be better at one particular phase or another. So what we say instead is we have a couple of broad guidelines that you should follow. At the early stages of growth, during the family and tribal and village stages, you're probably going to hire a lot more generalists than specialists. Things are still very up in the air, things still need to shake out, and having generalists allows you to have that flexibility within the organization. But as you grow and you reach these higher levels of scale, you're going to bring in more specialists because they have the right skills to manage that level. The other principle we say is, you really have to focus at the current stage you're at. Right? A lot of companies have gone wrong by saying, well, I've only got 10 people now, but I'm going to be huge someday. Let me hire somebody who's already managed 1,000 people. Yeah. Well, the person who's managed 1,000 people, those skills are completely different than the skills required to be a part of a 10-person team. I myself am more of an early stage person. I tell people, listen, if you need to figure out how to get your company on the map and you have no money, I'm your guy. If you have a budget of $100 million that you need to spend, go find someone else, because that's a completely different set of skills.
Is there a methodology how you would manage this transition? Imagine I've hired somebody, a generalist,
right.
And I mean, you don't want to fire those people. You want to either help them develop some other skills or put them into another place. But I find it quite hard to imagine how to really do this.
Yeah, and it's difficult. And part of it is just being willing to treat people with respect and treat people well, even if their role has to change. So, for example, let's say we bring in somebody as a manager, or let's say actually take the classic example of a founder. The company. The founder early on, founders are doing everything. This founder is running engineering. This founder is running all the business side of the world. Well, let's say this founder who's running engineering, as the company continues to scale, doesn't have experience running a 100-person engineering team. And they're not able to learn quickly enough. Well, now you need to bring in somebody else. So now you have to say, well, for this founder, what are they going to do? Are they going to become a manager who works for this person? Perhaps. Are they going to become more of a CTO or somebody who has more of a strategic portfolio and doesn't do direct day-to-day management? Perhaps. Are they going to focus on being a spokesperson or take on a completely different role? That's also a possibility. But the main thing is to say, look, let's be explicit about what's going on here. We need a set of skills that are associated with a higher stage, and you don't currently have those skills. So, if you want to grow into that, you may want to work for someone and learn. You take the example of Google, for example. Larry Page was the CEO of the company. He is the fellow who ran Google. They brought in Eric Schmidt, the investors did as well, in order to have somebody who had experience managing a large organization, and he helped them grow. But eventually, after they had been doing this for long enough, Eric Schmidt and Larry Page said, Larry can do it now. Let's bring him back as CEO. And now Eric gets to enjoy his well-deserved respite as executive chairman, whereas Larry is now more focused on the day-to-day.
Cool. Do you have any other examples where you can really vividly show what it is to blitzscale a company?
Absolutely. So, great example, this is one that we're actually going to probably use in the book, comes from Reed's days at PayPal. This is a fascinating one. So, PayPal was growing incredibly rapidly. And we think that the way they put it was the company was growing at 5% a day. So not a week, but a day.
Yeah.
So it was kind of nuts. And because they were dealing with money, anytime something went wrong, people got very angry about it. And so they would start emailing, the number of customer service tickets just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the way Reed puts it is, there were enough people who were trying to reach us that they went into the Palo Alto phone book, discovered the line for PayPal, and just randomly dialed extensions in order to reach someone. And so at any given time, every single phone in the office was ringing. And if you picked it up, there was an angry customer on the other end. So, it's like, well, what do you do? Well, you know what? You're now in a situation where efficiency is not the primary concern. Just dealing with this volume is the primary concern. So what actually happened was PayPal made a deal with the state of Nebraska, and flew out to Omaha, Nebraska, shook hands with the governor, got a building, and they flew basically the entire team of the company, and there were not that many people in the company at that point, to do group interviews to hire 100 customer service people in 2 weeks.
And they did not have any customer service agents before?
No.
Wow, okay.
And this was inefficient, right? So it was enormously inefficient. I think that the statistic was, of the people they hired in that first frantic wave, 70% had left within a month.
Wow.
Either because they didn't work out or because they said, this is insane, I can't deal with this. But they actually grew that customer call center in Omaha, Nebraska, and that became the customer call center for PayPal that was there all the way through the IPO and acquisition by eBay. And as Reed put it, they took one of PayPal's early employees and sent her out to Omaha. She was a young, smart generalist, said, figure out the problem.
Cool. Make
it happen. None of us knows any more than you do. But she did make that happen, and as it turns out, she also met her husband while she was out there, so it all works out in the end.
Cool. I mean, I guess not every blitzkrieg or blitzscaling is successful.
That's
do
right.
you have any stories of blitzscaling who failed? Or
so there's
could save
there are definitely some cautionary tales, and I think that you can look at, just recently in the news, for example, was a company called HomeJoy that was a service that allowed you to go online and book people to come clean your house. And there's some debate about whether or not that's a good service or good business model as a whole. But what was definitely true, and what the founders will tell you, is that they tried to scale up too quickly. Right? They decided, this is the right time to blitzscale. We're going to go into multiple cities. We're going to open up different offices. And there have been plenty of other companies who followed this same path. Basically, they said, we've figured this out. Now let's expand everywhere. And oftentimes that ends badly. In the case of HomeJoy, it's just too many commitments, fundamental unit economic problems, and ultimately the company went under despite 6 months before being hailed as one of the hottest companies on the internet.
But do you think this was a problem due to blitzscaling or scaling in general, or was it just that even the scaling would not have helped the unit economics?
So that's the interesting point. So I think that the point is the scaling wouldn't necessarily help the unit economics. You have to recognize that. So when your unit economics are poor enough, it is not a time where you can successfully blitzscale. Their thesis presumably was that this is a land grab and we need to get as much market share as possible, and scale will provide returns. And we talk in the book about what we call the first scaler advantage, right? The first person to reach massive scale in any given industry has a significant advantage. It's not the first person to enter. If early entry allows you to become the first person to reach scale, then great. But if you're not the first person to reach scale, the example I use is, as I recall, the first social network that I remember was called Rise, R-Y-Z-E. Well, guess what? They're not around anymore. Or maybe I think they actually are, but obviously they're not important, right? What mattered was being the first to reach scale, and different levels of scale. Friendster was the first to sort of reach scale, but fell upon hard times. MySpace reached another level of scale, but again, there were some fundamental problems. What that shows you is that blitzscaling is not a panacea, right? Just growing is not enough to make a business successful. The business underlying it has to be successful, but in order to take full advantage of the marketplace, that rapid growth can be a key tool.
Great. Chris, thank you so much for your time.
No, my pleasure.
And maybe next time, if you're thinking about starting a company, just check whether at some point in your startup journey that you try to blitzscale as well. Thank you so much. Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Such a pleasure.